Welcome back to this week's weekly webinar on what happens to the insects when it's raining outside and what are the consequences of a lot of rain. What does it do to insect populations? My name is Molly Keck and I am an integrated pest management program specialist with Texas A&M AGRILIFE Extension Service in Bexar County, and I'm also a board certified entomologist. So during a rainstorm, during the actual rainstorm, for the most part, insects can't fly. They're going to hunker down and go find some shelter somewhere else. They also, of course, will not be foraging for food, and pretty much all of their activity is going to stop until the rain actually stops. But there are some insects that can actually fly during the rain. One of those are bumblebees, which makes them a very unique insect, being able to do this, and also a really efficient and good pollinator. Honeybees and other bees really are not going to leave their nest or wherever they are nesting when it is raining, but bumblebees will continue to forage even during light rain. The main effect that rain has on insects is it will do one of probably four things. It may help them complete their life cycle in some way. It may cause them just to hunker down and they don't go out and become active. After the rain, it can probably make them be more active because they've been in hiding for a period of time, in essence. And it should also increase their food sources. If they are a plant feeder, a nectar, or a pollen feeder, then of course those plants are able to produce more, to grow and have nice juicy leaves. And so it increases the food source, which will help out the overall population of that insect species. The way that rain may affect the life cycle of an insect is that it could initiate them doing a mating swarm, or it might provide them with a water source which is necessary for them to lay their eggs. So many insects, especially termites and ants, will do some sort of a mating swarm when you hit about 100% humidity. So these are some images and videos of a Yopon holly that had at the base of it a fire ant mound. And when it was during some pretty good rainy periods, these fire ants, the alates or the reproductives, were just climbing up and down this little tiny tree, trying to find a place to take off to be able to do a mating flight. It had been so dry for so long that they were so desperate to do a mating flight that their workers were actually assisting with getting them up to the top of that, the tip top of that little tree. So ants and termites will do these mating flights. It's an initiation to fly up in the air and reproduce in some way. So termites and ants, the reproductives within the colony, there's a caste system. So there are reproductives and there are workers. The reproductives start out before they become queens or kings with wings. They have wings so that they can fly up in the air, mate in the air, and then drop back to the ground and start a colony. The big difference between ants and termites is that ants have a different kind of antenna than termites do. Ants have a kinked or an elbowed antenna, whereas termites have more of a straight antenna, looks like beads connected together. Ants have unequal length wings, whereas termites, their wings are the same length. And this is important because sometimes most of the time they drop their wings and you may not actually see the animal, but you see the wings that they've left behind. So by collecting those and checking to see if they're the same length or different lengths may tell you that you had ants or termites. But the biggest way that I tell the difference between ants and termites is I look at the waist. An ant has a pinched waist, and when that ant alate or reproductive dies, it will kind of bend in half, whereas termites have a thick waist, and so they don't have the ability to bend over or curl up when they die, so they usually kind of stand stock still once they have died. Here are some images of some different alate ants. You can see we have lots of different species of ants, and so we have lots of different looks to the alates of ants, so they may or may not look like the worker form of the ant. We have about 75 different species of ants in the state of Texas alone, so you're going to have lots of different looks to the alates that might emerge, and you might find them at your windowsills or outside or somewhere like that. And not every single species is necessarily one to be overly concerned about. We have a lot of native ants that might come up through the outside of plumbing and be attracted to lights. They're underneath the ground, and then that intense moisture, humidity from a rainstorm makes them become active. They're attracted to lights maybe inside of your house, and they squeeze through the corner of a window. There are lots of ways that ants can get inside. Really, though, you want to look for the foraging workers to be able to figure out how to manage the colony, because they're the ones that will take the baits back into, or the pesticides back into the colony. The alates aren't always the best. There's nothing you can really do about the alates. You got to figure out where the colony is to be able to manage it. Pretty much all termite species will swarm as well after we've had about 100% humidity or a good rainstorm. And one of those that happens in the summer and the fall are agricultural or desert termites. They become very, very active around those times of the year. They are generally, and we have different species, but they can be generally pretty large, robust termites that have an opaque wing, and the wings are very, very long. You can see them curled up there on that one that still has the wings attached. And this happens, I see this happen in the Central Texas area when we have a good drenching rain that has been preceded by months of a drought period. So they are taking advantage of this time when they're able to swarm, and they're going to get out there and do some swarming. And they can be found in pretty intense and immense numbers. You can find them piled up close to and underneath a porch light or a light side of the building. These termites, however, are non-structural termites. They do not feed on the wood in your house. They feed on forbs and grasses and roots. So if you have to have termites, these are the best ones to have. They can do some damage to weak and stressed grasses, but get those grasses healthy and these guys should not be an issue for you. Another termite that will swarm during this early spring through springtime is the subterranean termite, the regular old subterranean termite that we worry about getting into our home. So these guys are a structural pest. It depends on the kind of winter we had, the emergence of spring for them, what's going on inside of the colony, and rain. So all those things have to be in some sort of favor for them to be able to swarm. So it could happen in February, or it could happen March or April, maybe even into May sometimes. Subterranean termites have kind of a pearly, shiny wing. Their body is darker in color. This look is really typical of these subterranean termites, but you still always want to get someone to identify it for you properly before assuming that you have them. They look very similar to ants. People get these guys confused with ants a lot. In May through the summertime, FORMOSAN termites will do some swarming, and these guys look similar to those desert termites, so a lot of times the two will get confused depending on the time of year. FORMOSAN termites generally like to swarm around Mother's Day, but if we don't have rain around that time, then they'll swarm when we do get that good rain event. They are kind of a more brown in color. Their wings are a little bit more translucent than the desert termites are. They're smaller. When you look under the microscope, I'm looking at the venation of the wings, and I'm also looking at hairs that are on the wings. So you could very well have swarms in August or September. It just really depends on the rain events that are happening that year. And in Texas, it's so unpredictable that it's really hard to give a good period of time when we see swarming for our termites. So always get them identified, always get them checked out, but know that they could very well also be ants and nothing that you have to worry about. The other way that the rain events could increase and help out the life cycle of an insect is that it provides them with bodies of water for those insects that are water breeders. Mosquitoes are one of those. Mosquitoes and flies are one of those. So when we have water that's sitting in toys in your backyard, or tree holes, or just dry creeks that have now filled up, all of these little spots of water are places where adult mosquitoes will lay their eggs, and that's one reason why you see an increase of inactivity in mosquitoes right after a rainstorm. But in general, it takes them about a week to 2 weeks to complete from egg to adult, to now becoming an adult looking for food or for a blood meal. But after it rains, the adults that are out there are now they're seeking those water sources, so they're able to lay eggs. So she lays her eggs in the water. The larvae that hatch are in the water. The pupa that emerge from the larva are also in the water. The only one outside of the water is the adult. That's a moving target and really hard to control. So controlling the standing water is the best way, most efficient way, and the least environmentally impact way, because you're not utilizing pesticides to try to control the mosquitoes. There's also other non-biting flies. and other species of flies that will emerge and become high in population when we have a lot of rain. Midges are one of these. This is a non-biting midge, but there are some biting midges. If you live near a dry creek, a lake, a pond, somewhere, some source or body of water, and especially if you have lights on at night, you will see huge emergences of these midges after a period of time after we've had good rain. So they're a nuisance. They make a mess of your cars when you drive through them. They make it so that you really can't sit outside with the lights on because they're so annoying. But they're really just a nuisance more than an actual harmful thing like a mosquito is considered, because it can transmit diseases. These guys don't do that. Most midges are non-biting midges. And then there's a lot of filth flies and other types of flies that require at least a semi-aquatic environment in order to reproduce and continue their life cycle. So many filth flies are like blowflies and house flies. These guys, where you have dog food, bird food, chicken feed, trash that gets very, very wet and kind of soupy, it increases their population. So you'll see this even in nature where you don't necessarily have trash piles or food sitting out. But it is not unusual to see an increase in filth fly, house fly, and horse fly, and blowfly populations after we have good rain. There is in nature fecal matter that from wildlife, and so when that gets wet and moist, that increases their ability to complete their life cycle. And then the guys on the right are called soldier flies. Soldier flies will lay their eggs in compost, and so if you have left the lid off of your compost or you've done something like that, things that are kind of higher in protein, they will be attracted to it and lay their eggs. They really like wet compost type materials. It doesn't mean that your compost has gone bad. It just means that they're helping break that down a little bit quicker, dry it out, and they don't like to be in there as much. Or let them do their work and utilize that compost in a faster manner than you would letting it do it naturally on its own without the aid of these soldier flies. Rain can also cause insects to be more active and get on the move. And so many of those are usually ants and termites. In addition to seeing the alates, when it's 100% humidity and we have good rain, you also affect what's happening under the ground. It's wet under the ground. They don't want to drown. They're saturated, and so they start to push their colonies above the ground, and they pop above the ground. Fire ants are that top left-hand picture, and that's very common to see more mounds out during and after a rainstorm than when it's very dry. You also might be seeing a lot of these tiny little mounds with little holes in them. Those most likely are like a cheese ant or some other little species of ant that's native, not harmful. And you have to remember that they were under the ground prior to being noticeable above the ground. So was it harming your grass at that point? Probably not. They just didn't want to drown, and so they popped above ground. It is short-lived. It is a short-term thing. Eventually they'll move down, and all of those little pieces of soil will start to flatten back out again and fall into those little holes that they've formed. On the right-hand side is what desert or agricultural termites will do above the ground. You can see that they make mud tubes across the grass and the weeds, and you might see them doing the same thing, making trails, maybe not necessarily going up a blade of grass, but trailing across a trail. They cannot be exposed to the sunlight because they're very, very sensitive to drying out, and they're very good food for other things. So they make those little tubes to protect themselves as they're making their way to other spots to find food. But very common to see that activity increase after we've had good soaking rains. Fire ants will also be on the move through floods. So they're considered a floodwater species, which means that they have the ability to rise above the water, hang on and cling to each other, and float above the water until they hit land. And once they hit land, then they can start digging in the ground and making a new nest somewhere else. But inside of that clump of all of those fire ants, you have the queen, you have workers, you have the babies. So the whole colony essentially just leaves and floats above the water, and they can go many days doing that before they hit land. You may also notice just an increase in foraging activity. They're trailing. Ants in general are moving a little bit more. Where they're going, who knows? They might be finding a new spot to live. They might all be recruiting to a great food source, but it's not unusual when it's very humid, very wet, to see just a little highway of ants always moving along. That's not an uncommon thing at all. It's very much part of just the natural cycle of what they do when it does get very wet. The only insect that I'll really talk about treatment for in this presentation is the fire ants, And so we have different methods of controlling fire ants. You can treat individual mounds with baits, granules, dusts, or drenches. If you have to treat a whole entire area because there's just too many mounds to treat each one individually, then broadcast treatments are your better option. And in my opinion, baits are the better option over all of the other options that you have because they're more target specific. Fire ants take them out of the environment. Other ants may pick them up, but if fire ants are prevalent, then they're going to leave that food for those fire ants to get to. And then a lot of our beneficials are not going to have any reason to be attracted to that food. Butterflies, bees, pollinators. There's nothing sweet in a true fire ant bait, really shouldn't have anything sweet in it. So there's no reason they would land on the ground to go after it. So it's target specific, environmentally friendly, and can be very economical as well to use baits. That's my preferred way of controlling for fire ants. And we have lots and lots of different options of fire ants baits. We have baits and we also have granules. Granules are for broadcast as well. And you basically put it out on the ground, water it in, and it makes this barrier that will affect some of your soil dwelling beneficials. So you have to consider that if you're really into conserving those types of insects. Other animals, arthropods, that may become more active when it gets very wet are those that are just moisture-loving animals. And so those would be sow bugs or pill bugs, roly-polies, and also our millipedes. You will find more activity of those in your garden, more activity underneath rocks, underneath your potted plants. You might see them inside of your house more often. They like moist environments. And so if it rains really hard, they get washed out of their little hole that they're hiding in or underneath a potted plant or a rock, and they get on the move so they can just move. So it's not uncommon to see them inside. They're not structural pests. They're just a nuisance. Just sweep them outside. They won't harm anything in the house. They aren't smart, so they just move until there's something that stops them, and generally that's a corner inside of your home. Another insect that is very common when it gets very wet, but also just common, cosmopolitan all across the nation really, but in everybody's yard. If you were to take a sticky trap and put it on any windowsill, on any home, any office building, you would collect a springtail or two. You would definitely collect springtails on them at some point. So a very, very common insect. Sometimes though, when it gets very moist, because they are moisture loving animals, you will see their populations rise, and you'll see them more active instead of underneath those rocks, on top of the rocks, or they get to on the move and they might fall into your pool and you see what looks like shavings of pencil lead just floating in your pool. They aren't harmful. Yes, they'll come inside, seal things up well, but really they're so short-lived that you never really know if that pesticide you applied across your windowsills and your door frames is really killing them or if they were going to die anyway. So in my opinion, if they're going to die pretty soon anyway, just let them die naturally, and let's not expose our families and ourselves and the environment to those pesticides. Another insect that you're going to start seeing, I usually say that they come around Thanksgiving time. So, around November, we start to see trapdoor spiders get on the move. And this is usually weather dependent. If we have more rain in October, it's going to happen then. If we wait to have most of our rain in December, then that's when it will happen. They build a little burrow in the ground, and it's generally the males, and their little trap door that they have will start to get saturated with water and it will cave in, and then their little home gets wet. And so they move because, especially right after it rains, they are trying to get to a dry spot and they get to moving. And they are not smart, so they move until something stops them. And in one place you can find many, many spiders if you just happen to have a lot of them in your area. Very common. You don't have to be in a rural area to have them. They're very common in urban environments also. Totally harmless. I'm sure you could pick it up, although I wouldn't recommend it, but they're not going to attack you and they are not venomous. So they're really harmless and considered beneficial because they're helping control a lot of the insect population around your landscape. There is some increased activity after rain that's super common, and one of the reasons for that is because they've been locked away for a long time. And there's a lot of water that's now available for them so that they can drink up. So we definitely see pollinators become much more active after a rainstorm. especially with honeybees, they've been trapped inside their hive. They have cabin fever. They haven't been able to go out and forage, which is their job. And so as soon as the sun comes out and things dry up a little bit, you will see increased activity around your flowers. But also, those flowers probably now have the moisture to be able to produce more nectar for them and more pollen. So it's just a good time for these guys to go be looking for food. You will also and should also see a lot more activity of your butterflies and then your native pollinators, your native bumblebees. There's just more nectar in those flowers after it rains. If we have rain and then a few days without and then it rains again, and you kind of have this pattern of a couple days without rain and then good hard rain, that oftentimes will make it harder and more difficult for our pollinators because it will actually wash the nectar out, knock the nectar out and pollen of the flowers. So it's good to have good rain and then not rain for a good period of time, and then or just it rains, and then let everything bloom. So it's great to have moisture because it allows those pollinators to find food. So that concludes this week's weekly webinar. If you've missed any of our weekly webinars, be sure to check them out on this channel, My Extension 210.